Okay, so what do you think of the relationship between the snake and the tree in Genesis?
Jesus. So all of this has been recently drawn into question for me by some of the work of Anna Hillman. I think originally most of my opinions were related to specific interpretations of the story in Genesis, which I think I originally supposed to have been cribbed from what would obviously be a vast story that was probably orally transmitted by people I don't know who. But the story never seemed likely to me to have originated with the Jews or the Hebrews. It looked like it was cribbed, like there was a vast book that contained this origin story, or there was never a book. It had just been carefully orally transmitted, as most stories are, possibly in song, as most stories are and were, including probably the entire Torah. Before it was written, it was orally transmitted. We must imagine that things like the Iliad and the Odyssey were similar. They were not written down. They were orally transmitted. The whole idea of bards and poets is certainly involved. But to get back to the actual thing itself, what I usually imagine, and this is unfortunate because I'd like to have three perspectives to present instead of one. So we could present the one that is, sort of common, which is the snake is a bad thing, representative of a rebellious feature of... This all becomes very ironic because if God created the snake, right, then if God created this ridiculously, hyperbolically comical being, metaphysically comical, that we think of as Satan or the devil, that's a really bizarre thing for God to do, right? Like, not only that, I mean, yeah, it does seem interesting to have an opponent. That does seem interesting. But so let's just pretend for a moment that we have the regular, ridiculous interpretation that humans have, that the snake's a bad thing, and it's got some malevolent or malignant intention that it wants to, promulgate. Maybe it's jealous of the humans. Who knows why? Because if it's powerful and has the capacity to give the humans something that raises them to the register of the divine beings and their ways of seeing, why would it want to? What motivation could it? How does it possibly benefit? And one of the answers could be by investing an aspect of its own intelligence, its own form of intelligence in the humans, like a contagion, perhaps, that is transmitted generation to generation. It, in the same way that it might oppose God, which I think is a hilarious idea. Because, you're going to fail at every... how do you oppose God? The only thing you can really do is oppose yourself. So you're going to fail at every possible junction, which is a really strange, fraught, confusing idea. What being would want to do that? Unless, and we'll get there, unless something else is going on. So if it's the bad thing, then it gives us this bad thing called knowledge, which leads to something like conceptual knowledge, which is dead inside mostly. It doesn't have to be, but the way we use it, it is. And so we become cognitively dead inside in the aftermath of our processes of enculturation and languaging. But I'm gonna sing another story here in just a second. All right, so In May of 2002, a process began in my consciousness that appeared and felt very profoundly like the intrusion of another intelligence, and that intelligence seemed to be all-knowing in a way that was infinite, right? Not merely like knows all things, but is infinitely, inexhaustibly knowledgeable about all matters, including everything about the history of humans, our minds, our religions, all this stuff. And so I asked a lot of questions about this, and in fact, the one question that I was very curious about, particularly when it asked me what I wanted, was I want to understand what this story in Genesis is about. And it found that confusing. It seemed to be confused by that, since it appeared that everything was on the table. Like when it asked me what I wanted, it was like, you can have anything you want. And it's like, can I understand the story? And it asked me why I wanted that. And I said, because that seems to be where the problem gets started for us. But that's presuming that that story is important, or, actually relevant to our development as beings and so forth, which is a presumption I made because it just seemed puzzling to me all throughout my life. There's this catastrophic accident, apparently. No one does anything to fix it. We are told that it was good before and it was terrible after, and it would be terrible basically forever. And there's no resolution. It's just, sorry, everything used to be good. You're screwed forever now. Here's the moment where it happened. Good luck. Right? It just seemed really weird to me. So I thought perhaps if we could understand the story more clearly, we might produce something like an antidote or a medicine. And I was told various stories about this. Some of them are quite beautiful. I have records of a few of them, but I can only remember one or two. And one of them is that in the origin place, there are these two aspects, which are, you can see them as separate or not. I call one the being that dwells in unity. This is not merely the sum of all beings, it's the sum of all possibilities of beings as a transcendental one entity. It's not clear that it's the only one there ever was or will be, or that there are no others of its register. But around here, it might as well be true that is so. So that being relates with, which is a relatively masculine being with feminine qualities too, relates with a feminine being that has some masculine qualities, perhaps. I'm not sure about these things. They seem to me to be profoundly masculine and feminine. But so there's the being that dwells in unity, and it relates with this transcendental entity that I call the living waters, which is feminine. And by touching and being reflected by the living waters, the being that dwells in unity comes to know itself. And similarly, by being touched and reflected in the being that dwells in unity, the living waters comes to know herself. And so these are sort of a primordial couple in the place outside of time that I call the origin place, like a child might, because I don't know what else to call it. And so these two beings mate, and they produce a progeny that is extremely precocious and resembles its father, is sort of masculine. Perhaps it's masculine because it is distinct. It's a very peculiar quality to be distinct. It's not clear that the being that dwells in unity can be distinct, nor that the living waters can be distinct, only that we can think of them this way. So they produce this prodigy, and it's in the origin place, and there's nothing for it to mate with. It can't mate with its father, and it can't mate with its mother, and so it just doesn't have anything kind of to do, and it's extremely precocious and has the desire to make and go and do, just like any separate entity might. So what that being does is it punches a hole in the origin world, and thus is born, in a sense, from this leak in the trans-dimensional, trans-temporal, trans-material place, is born the possibility of time-space. Perhaps this resembles the Big Bang. This is the moment, this is the transforming thing that caused poop, right? infinite density becomes whatever it becomes. Though I think the Big Bang is a ridiculous fairy tale that doesn't make any sense. It's kind of a problem where it's like, give me one miracle and I'll explain all the other things, right? Scientifically, anyway. Though I understand the arguments for it, and I'm not entirely immune to them. So that thing, by punching a hole in the origin place, sort of created like a reflection of the living waters that we call time, space, or the universe. And instantaneously traversed in a sort of tree pattern within that living kind of mirror of the origin place's character and activity. It created like an instantaneously branching situation inside time space, along which would naturally develop galaxies and starbirth nurseries and stars and planets and moons and ice, whatever, all the things that would develop, including organisms. And so everywhere you see a star or a galaxy or something like this, what you're really seeing is the reflection of the first moments of its transition throughout all of time space. And if you think about it carefully, if you want to have a material universe, you need something that departs from unity. Trippy idea. Something that naturally departs from unity. And if you think of the idea of the adversary, right, not as a mean thing or a lawyerly thing, but just something that departs from unity, now you have the possibility of beings appearing as distinct. You have all these amazing possibilities that you really can't have if there's just one thing or two things. So in a sense, one could imagine that this first angel, I'll call it an angel, was in fact, in a way not dissimilar to what the Gnostics think, the creator, quote unquote, of this universe, or the demiurge, or something like this. So that being has the capacity to divide things, and its primary power as sort of one of the imagine the reverse of an umbilical. What's the inversion of an umbilicus? Because that's sort of what this thing is. It is a cutter. It cuts things, it divides them. And by dividing them, it makes possible all kinds of diversity that is otherwise impossible. So it is highly creative, and you could say that it's fertilizing identity and possibility through this action of transcendental differentiation. So there are stories in which it is imagined that Yahweh is not God, but is one of the Elohim, and is not a good Elohim, but a bad Elohim that wants blood and gore and slaughter and agony and judgment, and it's kind of like a tantruming baby. I'm a jealous, fierce, destroying, God, and that the serpent is trying to protect the humans from that, right? Like wants to inoculate them, and perhaps. Well, we'll get back to that story in a minute. Let's go to the first one. So, in my little fairy tale, a child's tale of what happens at the tree, this is important. So, everything has a place where it was divided from the unity. On our body, this would be our umbilicus. Once we were intrinsically connected to the unity inside our mothers. For paper, it's the edge of the page. For animals, there's probably something like an umbilicus for most animals, but they have sort of many of them have a kind of a metaphysical version that we call a tail, which is really a trippy thing when you think about it. It's almost like a separate organism attached to the animal. This strongly resembles and is reminiscent of the sperm's driving motor, which is a organelle containing mitochondrial DNA. It's basically a strand of mitochondrial DNA, if I recall correctly. And so it's the memory of the mothers, right, that is driving this swimmer in a mass exodus into the possibility And it's not, we think like, the sperm are, they're competing together. Let's like a horse race. Which one wins? That is not what's happening. What's happening is the entire cohort of sperm are promoting the best of their, not just the best, the most appropriate for the given situation, moment, context, place, person, lineage. They're promoting each other in a way that involves drafting and hitchhiking and all of these things, right? So they're essentially promoting the contenders for fertilization, and then those contenders arrive in the near proximity of the egg, and the egg electromagnetically modulates the environment to be selective of the few sperm that get there first. So the egg can actually, apparently, from what I've come to understand, have a selective influence on which sperm get there and which sperm, what we might call, lock the door. Because once one of them embeds, the egg locks the door. And sometimes two of them embed at the same time. You get twins. There's other situations under which you can get twins. But the really interesting thing is that for a time after the locking of the door, the tail is attached to the outside of the egg and is alive, and the payload is entering the egg. And so you can imagine that all of us might remember a lost companion because we left someone. We left the one that we traveled with, right? We left that one at the gate, and it was alive, and we were the same thing. We were together, and then we were apart, and then it was alive, and then we were becoming a being while it was at the edge of the egg, sort of signaling to us, I remember you. We are together. Don't forget me, right? All of these very heroic and romantic ideas that remind me of, for example, the film Hidalgo and the relationship between the rider and the horse in this film. Very brilliant, heroic film. So, back to the story. You have these two different kinds of beings. You have an angelic being, which I will just call the first angel. And then you have... By the way, you can think of this angel as red if you imagine that red means to depart, right? To depart from unity into distinction is red. And to return to unity from distinction could be blue. In this particular model, there's other ways to think about it. So you have an angel that is a non-corporeal being, and then you have what I might think of as the proto-forms of the humans. We can think of them as humans, but I think they're sort of like the spiritual potential that will become embodied as humans later is how I usually think about it. But basically what you have are the transcendent, non-corporeal child, and then you have the sentient, soon-to-be or already material child, which must be a very bizarre prodigy to an angel. How could there be beings made of stuff, right? That's such a weird idea. There are no stuff things for the angel, and the angel is the father of stuff in a way in this story, but still, the idea that there could be beings made of stuff would be really trippy. So these two children are there in the garden. Oh yeah, okay. I have to get back to the dividing thing. All right. So a long time ago, I was in a art studio that had kilns and produced art marbles. These are large and small glass marbles filled with colored molten stuff, and they're really trippy and amazing. And most of them are very close to perfect spheres for an object made by hand. And so the process is you take a rod and you put it in the kiln, and there's a crucible in there, and you get a glob of glass on the end. The glass is clear. And then you roll that glob in some busted up little shards of various materials that melt on the surface of the glob. And then you dip it in the kiln again and get more glass on it. So now you have like 1, 2, 3 layers of glass. And then you take that and you roll it inside. You turn it like a rod. You turn the rod inside a half spherical piece of wooden cup, right? With a divot sort of out of the outer side of it. So you're turning it in there, And then suddenly when you get a pretty good shaped ball and you're happy with the sphericity of the ball after turning it in there, you have to pull the rod out of the glass. When you do that, it makes a tail. Now you have a problem, because now you got to hide that tail, right, in order to make it look like the sphere is miraculously perfect, right? Can't have a tail. So you have to hide that tail. And that's really one of the most difficult things to do. I tried it a couple times. It's very difficult to hide the tail. And so what I'd like to suggest is that the Earth, quote unquote, which could have been the protoform of the Earth, had recently been divided from the unity, and so had this sort of umbilical remnant. And the angel that did the dividing is at this remnant and is the snake, the one who divides. Obviously, one of the ones who divides things from life, right? If it's venomous or not, if you're an animal or an insect or whatever, it eats you, divides you from life. But if it's venomous and it bites you, you become divided from life. But it has this is the dividing angel. It's the angel that makes cuts and distinguishes things and departs from unity. This is entirely holy. There's nothing evil about that. Without that, you can't have universes or beings or anything. But it's very curious about the humans, and the humans are very curious about the angel. And when God says, of all the trees in the garden you may eat, but do not eat of the tree in the midst of the garden, this word is not midst. I mean, it may be that we, this is what is written or whatever, but the word midst is based on an unused Hebrew root, tavek. Tav, vav, kaf. And this does not mean middle. It means to put apart. It means to part. Right? Mm-hmm. So what it's actually... And no, I've never heard I don't know a single person that knows about this. I've talked to rabbis. They're like, how did you learn this? We have no idea about this. How did you even know this root existed? This is something that the angel taught me. So, and when it told me these stories, showed me these stories, I should say. So it means essentially where the garden is parted, right? Which is a very strange thing. And also, Yahweh God does not say, do not eat of the tree of life. Doesn't say that. He says, do not eat of the tree in the midst of the garden, this tree of knowledge, or you will in that day die. And so Eve somehow finds herself at this tree. The serpent is there. They have this conversation in which the serpent says, you will not really die. It's good for seeing. You'll become like us. You become makers, right? Well, if you can't part things, you can't make things, right? I mean, literally, you have to part the lips of a vagina with your penis to make a baby, right? Parting and making, fundamentally, intimately linked together. So, Eve and serpent have a little conversation. One of the joys of my home is the rolling garage doors, the beautiful sound, the musical, joyful sound they make when they're rolled up. They come together. The snake tells her, it is good for seeing. Now think about representational cognition. It is good for seeing, right? It gives you a variety of ways of seeing that are interesting and powerful, particularly weirdly compelling when divided from participatory experience and cognition and consciousness. But it gives her something which is posed as a fruit, a kind of fruit of a tree. A fruit. Okay, think carefully about that, because that is the reproductive organ of the tree. So in a sense, one could imagine that the serpent causes the tree to have a kind of intercourse with Eve, to fertilize her with knowledge. And this knowledge is certainly related somehow to death, even though it doesn't kill you outright. So, one of the stories is the two different kinds of children of the being that dwells in unity come together at the tree, and one of them gives the other one its toys, right? Which is natural for children. I got this great toy. Want to play? It helps. It's fun to play. You're going to love this, right? And perhaps perhaps Eve also had a toy to share, which could conceivably have been her reproductive organ, right? That somehow reproductive organs and toys are kind of similar in some unusual sense that we are not commonly inclined to understand. So then somehow Eve introduces Adam to the knowledge. And I think it's very important to understand that, at least throughout the Bible, and there are probably other books that have this property, knowledge and intercourse are strongly linked. They're not exactly the same thing. They don't have to be the same thing, and the word doesn't always mean the same thing, but it often implies the kind of knowledge that you would have if you were kissing someone intimately or having intercourse with them, which is an entirely different kind of knowledge than representation, right? It's an intimate, visceral, trans-somatic experience of participatory union, reunion, communion, this kind of thing. So this all happens. It's hilarious that Adam and Eve then become very concerned about their genitalia. That's a very strange result, hard to understand. God comes back, they are hiding. I was like, where are you? And I was like, we are hiding. And God's like, why are you hiding? And I was like, because we are bad. I don't know. I'm like, what do you mean you are bad? How could you know that there's badness? Right? You were innocent. Something has gone funky here. And also, obviously, if God is omnipotent, two problems ensue. The first one is, tell the children not to do something. You think they're then going to not go not do that? How many times have you told children not to do something and found that they just never went and did it? So there's that problem. But then there's also the problem of, obviously God knows, God can see from outside of time. So knows exactly what's going to occur. But the story is told as if time is linear and God doesn't know these things, which is a very strange thing to me. So then, now I don't know if it actually says this. I don't think it does. Perhaps it's merely traditional to think this. Or it's the result of a painter's intelligence. And forgive me for lecturing here, but this is a long answer to a complex question. They covered their genitalia with something, apparently. Possibly a fig leaf. At least this idea comes down to us. And I just can't remember if in the Bible it's a fig leaf or not. Right? If in the Torah they say this or not. Or it could be that an artist's representation later selects the fig leaf, and this is why we have this myth. But there's a very, very interesting feature of the selection of a fig leaf. Staggeringly profound that I think also very, very few people would think of in relation to this story, which is the fig leaf's flower is invisible. It's microscopic. You can't see it. So they're hiding, at least if this is the trope, wherever it may come from, whether it's from an artist or the Bible or whatever it's from. It's a very interesting choice because you're hiding your genitalia with the leaf of a tree whose flower cannot be seen. That's very trippy. So then God comes and hands out curses. And the way that what I was shown about this is that this is not in any way God cursing the humans. What's going on here is that God, in infinite wisdom, realizes that the humans are going to feel shame and they're going to feel guilt because they did the bad thing that they were told not to do. And so really what God's doing is nothing at all. He's just telling the humans that there will be consequences so that they can feel relieved of their wrongdoing because an accounting game has ensued where, they will have things that function not dissimilarly from punishments. But God isn't imposing these punishments at all. And these aren't curses or anything like that. These are just the natural repercussions of what has taken place that would happen whether God imposed curses or not, right? The humans are now going to sort of fall from transcendental naivete and innocence into knowledge. naming and distinction, representational cognition, all these things, and they're going to become material beings, right? They're going to become fully material beings, and they will thus undergo the amnesia, right? The sort of cascade of amnesias that happen between before conception, during conception, through the embryology, through the birth, post-birth, through the phases of development, languaging, and acculturation. It's basically a series of cascades of amnesia that get imposed on us, and then we have to contend with somehow. So, but weirdly and astonishingly, one of the curses God hands out is that the snake will now have to go on its belly, which causes me to, and always has caused me to wonder, what the hell was it doing before that? Because if the snake wasn't going on its belly, or on the earth, and getting, having problems with dust and things, what the hell was it doing? And the only thing I can possibly think of is that it was flying, right? Or maybe it was even not material, and so maybe they both became material. They both became materially incarnate, and so what we have is this kind of primordial pairing of the hominids and the snake, right? Which you can imagine for ancient peoples, and if we evolved from primates, which I'm not entirely certain of, even though I know all the stories from science about this, it just seems ridiculous that some monkey species kept mutating and produced us, which we are a weird anomaly on this planet, to put it mildly. I have no reason to believe that we are the natural product of nothing other than accidental evolution over time. I find that a very strange idea. Conceivable, I'm willing to entertain it, but I find it weird. So there's this primordial pairing of the snake and the primates, and you gotta understand, that snake thing is super powerful in the psyche of any animal like us. It kills our children. There's times where we're swinging, the primates are swinging through the tree, and Jane and Jim, monkey guys, are swinging branch to branch, and then Jane grabs a branch and it's not a branch. Oh shit, it's a snake, and it eats her right in front of her husband. Right? It looks like a branch of the tree, but it isn't, right? It's a monster, or it's not your friend, almost never your friend. So this is a very strange property of the snake, the camouflage, right? It's death hiding in something that looks familiar and that you're intimate with because you grab it. You grab a stick, right? If you grab it, is the stick a snake? Is the snake a stick? You can't tell. And the stick is the primordial tool. So this relationship between snake and stick is fundamentally profound. Also, the snake divides the universe by going. Imagine a snake, slithering through the sand, right? And you can see that the world is divided, but it's also a wave. It's divided by a wave, and this wave thing, it's like a living wave creature. It's crazy, the thing. And also, I don't know how much time you spent hanging out with snakes, but if you spent much at all, and I've spent a little bit with wild snakes, those animals are not ordinary beings. There's no chance. They're just not ordinary beings. They are transcendental beings, partially embodied here in this form. They are the part and parcel of everything magical, everything medicinal. It all comes from this thing. And it's not just, you have stories that are way older than anything from Genesis or the Bible. Presuming that Genesis wasn't cribbed from a much older story, say a story 8 to 10,000 years old. There's no way to imagine the incredible potency of the snake in the origin of human cognition, thought, religion, medicine, magic, everything. Everybody who's holding a rod or a staff or something like that, they're holding a snake. It's just a frozen snake. You see in this film, The Ten Commandments, where Moses comes to meet the Pharaoh, right? The Pharaoh brings out his sorcerers, and they drop their rods on the floor, and the rods become snakes. And then Moses drops his living rod, his rod that has living stuff growing out of it, and it becomes a snake that eats all of theirs, right? And so therefore the Pharaoh knows, oh shit, yeah, something's going on here. We're in trouble. our power is not, has no primacy in this matter. Additionally, but in much older stories, like the Blackfoot origin story, where the sun and the moon are going to come Okay, first of all, there's a problem on the world. There's a problem in the world. It wasn't called Earth. It's the Hogan place, the sun's Hogan. And the problem is there's snakes everywhere. There's swarming with snakes. So the sun gets really hot and burns them all up. But they hide in the cracks in the earth, there's so many metaphors here that I'm not going to even start to elucidate. And then once that's done, the sun and the moon come down to the earth, and this is their home. They're like their hut or their teepee, right? And then they mate, and they have 7 children. And I'm not going to tell the whole story, but essentially what happens is the sun takes the 7 male children go hunting with the sun every day. He's a hunter. And when the sun comes home, the sun has a very articulate sense of smell, a very sensitive sense of smell. And the sun determines that the earth has been messing around with something. The moon has been messing around with something. And so they surreptitiously follow the moon, and they find out that she has taken a lover. And the lover is described, in I think a very important way, as a many-legged snake that lives in a hollow log. This is a mystery that must be resolved, and I've been chasing it for many years. So you can see that there's this, long before anything like the Bible or Genesis or anything, we got this problem with chicks messing with snakes. Way back. This story is at least 5,000 years old, and possibly 15 or 20. Like, it's a really old story. This just goes back forever. To finish up this part of the thing, what happens up in the origin place after the birth of the first angel who leaves is the birth of the second angels, and they are like Russian dolls. They contain each one of the second angels, let's say there's 5 of them. Each one of them contain the first angel, and they have very specific, elaborate abilities that differ from mere division. The primordial power is to divide, but then there are secondary powers that are very profound. One of them could simply be to reunite, right? But another could be to distinguish. Another could be to pathfind within intelligence, right? Not just time space, right? Not just like a scout, but a scout is a very profound power, because the scout leaves the unity to see for the unity out beyond where the unity is. So they have these different powers, and then there are the third angels and the fourth angels and so forth. They contain the previous generations within them in this toy of the situation. And what are the angels? They are the enactions above time space, but also within it, of the unique potencies of the divine being, and also the divine pair, and also the divine pair within the origin world. So they are a bit like, it's a bad analogy, but they're a bit like living tools. They have each a very specific array of capacities at which they excel. Further questions?
Well, okay, so what relationship then do you see between conceptualization and death?
Wow, great. We'll have to continue that one.